Hello, my name is Stephanie Saunders, and I'm here to talk to you about sophisticated schema mocking. So glad to see all you people here interested in quality and testing. It's great to see that. All right, so just a little bit about me. I live in Colorado with my husband and my 4 children. It's okay, you can say it. That's a lot of kids. I've been at Coinbase for about 2.5 years. And I started out as an IC, and then about 5 months ago, I transitioned to engineering manager. I figured if I could manage my 4 kids, I probably could manage a few engineers. So the whole time that I've been at Coinbase, I've been in the developer experience org. And our mission is to increase the velocity and the quality of our customers. And when I say customers, I'm talking about the Coinbase engineers, because we work on the internal tools and systems that they use. So within DevX, I am on the data layer team. Now we are a full stack team, and we are responsible for the GraphQL service and the schema. And we're also responsible for a client library that we call the data layer. Now this is an in-house library that serves as a wrapper around our GraphQL client. In our case, we use Relay. So we did this so that we can easily add extensions and helper functions to Relay when we need to. So in our code bases, we don't allow any direct imports from the Relay libraries. Instead, you can only import Relay hooks and utils from our data layer library. By the way, having an internal library like this is a really good idea. Just remember that I said that because I'm going to come back to it later. Fun fact, my team does have a logo. So when your team owns something, a centralized service like GraphQL, you're going to find yourselves in just in the middle of a lot of incident investigations. And that's why our logo is a red herring. All right, over the last couple years, my team has been supporting a massive migration in our flagship React Native app to migrate from REST to GraphQL. So we provide the support and the tooling and the best practices for this migration. And honestly, one of the biggest customer complaints that we have had throughout the whole process is that it is very difficult and frustrating to mock GraphQL in unit tests. So that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So a bit of a roadmap for my talk. First, I'm going to share some of the out-of-the-box mocking tools that we have tried, the good and the not so good about those tools. Then I'm going to share how we implemented our current mocking strategy based off of what was lacking in those tools. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the cool things that our sophisticated mocking strategy has allowed us to do. Just a word of caution. If you're really into test architecture, it is possible that this talk might trigger you. I'm pretty sure that we're not doing things exactly the way that you would do it, and that is fine. That's not the point of this talk. The point is to just showcase some solutions that we came up with within the confines of what we were already doing with testing without having to re-architect the whole thing. So for example, I'm going to use the words unit test. And you might look at the code that I'm going to put on the screen and say, that's not a unit test, that's an integration test, or that's a functional test. And that is totally fine. If you want to call it an integration or functional test, that is not going to hurt my feelings. Okay, got the awkward stuff out of the way. Let's dive in. All right, so let's say we have this simple component. We're using the relay hook, use lazy load query, imported from our data layer. And this component queries for name and displays it to the screen. Very simple. So when you first think about how to mock this in a test, you might think of something like Nock. So this is probably what you use to mock your REST endpoints. And it's very simple, very easy to use. It's definitely something that we did. But there are some drawbacks. First of all, the mocked data has to match your query request exactly, including mocking all of the IDs that are going to be required by your client cache. And this is actually a big problem. So for example, right now with the code that I showed you, this test is going to pass. But let's say we want to add some more data to this component. We update the query, display this new data to the user, we run our unit test, and now our test is broken. So first of all, you're going to get a warning from your client library that the payload didn't match the request. And second, if your component is expecting this data to be present, you're going to get an error during render. So basically, this makes your test very brittle, and you need to update the mocks every time you add data to your components. And this is very frustrating and tedious for engineers who already don't like the idea of writing and maintaining tests. Another problem with Nock is that there really isn't an easy way to inspect the query variables if you want them to customize the data you're returning. So if you need to access the query variables and ideally the whole request, you might try something like Mock Service Worker. So Mock Service Worker is actually really great because you can register a service worker that listens to your fetch requests and intercepts them right there at the network. It's really nice if you want to mock both REST and GraphQL at the same time because you can define handlers for both cases. Your mocking lives outside of your tests, which is really great for separation of concerns, could be good for end-to-end testing, just that decoupling is just really nice. And you can see in this example, you can return dynamic mocks based off of query variables. But again, the mocks still need to match your request exactly. Also, Mock Service Worker does not have great support for React Native. So if you wanted to run this alongside your simulator to get some mock data, it's going to be very difficult. It does run fine in Node, so if you want to use it for your React Native unit tests, that's fine. You just need to spin up an extra server that is going to intercept any requests that are called through your render functions in your tests. And you do need to remember to set it to listen and to close within your jest config setup. So just a little bit of extra setup and config associated with using Mock Service Worker. What about some of the built-in mocking tools that are provided with some of the popular GraphQL clients, like Apollo client? So Apollo gives you something called mocked provider, and it's actually great. It's very simple to use. You just simply pass in a mock object and you wrap the provider around your component and you're good to go. But again, the mocks have to match the operation exactly. And in this case, they're actually even more brittle because the variables have to match exactly as well. Otherwise, your mock is not going to be returned for your request. So let's take a look at Relay. Relay does give us some really nice out-of-the-box testing tools. Relay gives you MockPayloadGenerator, and this is actually going to give you a dynamic response based off of the operation shape. So now our test is going to look like this. No specific field mocking needed. When we add some data to our component and run our test again, it's going to pass because MockPayloadGenerator will automatically return a value for all requested fields. But you'll notice in this console log that every value returned is a string named mockValue4 and the field name. And this actually isn't ideal either. What if we want to add a date field to the query? And let's say we run it through an unforgiving date formatter in our component. Well, our test is going to fail because the component is expecting a valid date format. At this point, the only way to fix this is to add an override mock back in our test. At least with this tool, we can specify the exact type that in the schema that we want to override here. So instead of passing the full data viewer user properties object, we can go straight to the user properties type and only return the one field that we want to override, which is actually really nice. Let's take a look at another scenario though. So how about we add some hook to our component that contains its own query? This is not something that we recommend doing, by the way, but it happens. A lot of times people will copy and paste a hook from somewhere else in the code base and not really look at what's going on in there. So in this scenario, your test is going to fail because only one query is getting the data that you mocked, so your component is going to suspend. Hopefully you don't waste too much time figuring that out. Then you realize you just need to add the mock for the second query that was added to this component. So you go into your test, you queue up another operation. Super easy, right? Nope, your test is going to fail because you just mocked your operations out of order. So your nice date override is now going to the new query that was added and not the one that needs it. So we spent so many hours helping customers debug out of order mocking that we finally wrote a custom wrapper around queue operation resolver to let people define their mocks by operation name. But even with that helper, every query needs to be accounted for in the tests. All right, let's recap a little bit. So what are some of the issues we came across? With Nock, we have static mocks and not easy access to your query variables. Mock service worker, static mocks, no React Native support, and just some extra config involved. Apollo, again, static mocks, even more brittle because you have to match the variables as well. Relay does give you dynamic mocks, but they only return strings, and you have to mock your operations in order. Okay, so what do we really need? We need a solution where no mocking is required just to render your component. That means adding queries and fields to a component does not break every single test. We want clear access to the query variables and ideally the entire request data. And we want the test to be easy to set up with very little code so that your engineers are more likely to be writing and maintaining tests. All right, remember when I said that it is a really good idea to have a data layer library? Well, this is why. Everything you need to mock your request at the network level is right here under your control. So let's take a look at how this is set up. So we create a network layer that Relay uses for sending process requests to the server. So your app executes a query or a mutation. It goes through our data layer wrapper and executes the actual Relay hook. And the Relay environment sends that request through our network layer, which executes a fetch function that sends a post request to our GraphQL service. The service response is then passed along back to the app. So this means that we are in a position to inject network middleware before the fetch is ever executed, because we own that network layer. And that middleware can process the request and send it back to the app without ever calling the fetch function. So we don't need to configure a separate service worker that can only listen to node fetch, and we don't need to spin up a separate server. So just digging a little bit deeper into this network middleware, we have access to the entire request and variables, which means that instead of using a list of static responses based off of operation name, we can use something like Graphql-tools mock from the Guild. Thank you to the Guild. This gives us some really great tooling that we can use to add dynamic mocks to our schema. So we use add mocks to schema and execute GraphQL to create a mock server that's going to return a mocked response to any query input that we give it. And these responses will automatically match your schema types. String returns a string, int returns an int, date a date. It's going to return your enums that live in your schema, and so forth. Now, the default data in this tool is somewhat random, so you can initialize this with some set of base mocks so that you can reduce like test flakiness. So if you want your default types to be consistent, these default mocks can live in your data layer library and they can be initialized with this data. And just between you and me, that default date is my birthday. It's not the right year, obviously. So. All right, so what does it look like to initialize this in the app? So because we have a wrapper in our data layer around creating a relay environment, we call it create GraphQL environment, we simply add an argument for initializing our interceptors. So you can easily add a helper function in your unit tests that returns a GraphQL environment that is initiated to intercept all network requests when it is used. So this is what our test looks like using this mock server middleware. 3 lines of code, no mocking required. And by using this mocking strategy, we have solved all of the previous issues that we had with the out-of-the-box solutions. And when we run this test with our 2 queries and all of our extra data fields, the test is going to pass. All the queries and fields automatically mocked correctly, even the IDs. So this solution works with no mocking required. But even better, if you do want to see some specific values in your tests, you still have the ability to override those base mocks. So just looking again at how we initialize this middleware, you'll notice that you still have the ability to pass in mock overrides, resolvers for specific fields in case you want to customize what you're returning based off of the variable. And you can give it default enums, again, to reduce test flakiness. You can even send it an entirely new set of base mocks. We also added one more argument called debug operations, and this basically gives you better visibility into what data is being mocked for your queries. So you can pass in a specific operation name or just a star to see them all. And the mocked data will print out to the console so you can see exactly what was mocked for every single field. And this has been really useful for test debugging. All right, one more time, digging into the middleware in more detail. This middleware is initialized with the parameters in the config, and any overrides that have been passed get deeply merged with the base mocks, and those are used as arguments for add mocks to schema along with your schema definition. And then we call execute GraphQL with the query and the variables from the requests, and then any operations that have come in from debug operations that we want to print to the screen during that process. Then we send the mocked response back to the app in place of the network response. All right, so using the mock server in our data layer library means we can add as many fields and queries to our components as we like, and we never have to update the mocks unless we want to. And we automatically get full test coverage for the component and any child component that it renders as well. All right, so that gets our unit testing in a pretty good place. What about manual testing? How can we use this middleware to level up that manual testing? So when you run your app in dev or staging, you're still getting data from those dev or staging backend services. And it can be hard to modify that data to get you into specific scenarios. How many times have you had a bug with a list of like 20 repro steps just to get your test user into a particular state so that you can debug what is going wrong? Or sometimes you find yourself in an incident that was caused by a specific value from a single field in production, and you're unable to reproduce that state in a development environment where you have better logging and debugging tools. So what we did is we added middleware after the request comes back from the network that can override single fields with mock data. So the workflow here is the app executes a query or mutation, it goes through our data layer wrapper, executes the relay hook. Again, relay environment sends that through our network layer, which executes the fetch function, gets the request from a GraphQL service, and then instead of passing that request directly back to our app, we run it through our post-fetch middleware. And this parses through the request, and then we send the modified response back to the app. So in dev, we can pass in an object that's basically just a list of field paths and values. And in the middleware, we traverse the payload and override the response with those specific path value pairs. This is really useful for testing scenarios where Let's say you want to test if your resolver errors and it returns null, or if you want to test a specific mutation failure. And I have to say, this feature is probably the most praised feature we have ever released from the data layer. All right, so how else can we use this field level mocking? Let's say you want to speed up developer velocity by using client schema extensions. That way your client engineers don't have to wait on the backend schema and resolvers to be written to start your client work. Relay and Apollo support client schema extensions, but in order to populate the fields with mock data, they need you to write that data first to the local cache. And that's just yet another thing that our customers would need to learn how to do. So now, because they're already using the field level mocking, utilizing client schema extensions all of a sudden becomes very easy. The field level mocking allows us to create the schema extension and simply add the mocks via the middleware. So now our client engineers can prototype new features and they don't even have to talk to the backend engineers. All right, what else? Well, now that we have these sophisticated mocking tools, we can create things like our live Storybook sandbox. So what if you wanted to develop data components in isolation without having to spin up your main app? And you want to see what they look like with actual data, or you want to override that data with some specific mock data. So we've created an extension on Storybook that allows you to do that. So because we use Relay, we can parse the component and discover its data requirements. Then we can overwrite those fields in a Storybook context. In order to parse those field paths and display that to the UI, we created a component and a GraphQL parsing engine. And because we have these parsing engines, we can also do other pretty awesome things, like we can create a tool that auto-generates unit tests for new components. It will automatically bootstrap these tests for you just based off of this parser looking at your components. So some pretty awesome stuff that can come out of these tools. Having these tools just unlocks a lot of developer productivity wins. All right, so in closing, let's just highlight the benefits again. So when you can automatically mock entire queries, you can easily write and maintain your unit tests. You get full code coverage by default. When you can mock individual fields, you can reproduce incidents quickly and precisely, and it makes it very easy to test specific data scenarios in your debugging environment. And having these types of tools unlock a lot of possibilities to build upon them and create other really great tools for your engineers to use. All right, make sure that you go and check out Ernie's talk this afternoon. He is also on the data layer team, so you already know so much about him. All right, thank you very much. And we do have time for some questions in case you guys have any. Yeah.
If you do have questions, please use the microphone so everyone can hear, and if you could return it back to the table, that would be great. Thank you.
Back there.
When you write tests and you're dealing with lists in a query, at least from our experience mocking, there's some limitations on how you can mock a list and how can you control the number of elements in the list. And have you guys run into this limitations as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is actually something that is automatically built into the Graphql-tools mock. So you can go to that type that is going to return your list, and then you can just declare like a new array and put in a static number of how many elements you want to be returned. If you don't override that field specifically and just let it be default, then the mocking is just going to give you some random number of items in that list, which may or may not be fine depending on what you're trying to test. But yeah, there is a way to do that. So, does that answer your question? All right. Well, if you have any other questions, then feel free to come and talk to me afterwards. But thank you, guys.